The Utah State Legislature is considering changing how Utahns vote in ways that would affect the state's long-running vote-by-mail system. But would these changes actually boost public confidence in elections?
Bring in this voter ID aspect to making sure that, yes, people can still mail in their ballot, they can still have that convenience, but it can bring in this extra amount of confidence that Utahns clearly support.
On this episode, we explore the reasoning for reforming Utah's vote-by-mail system through the lens of whether such changes would increase or decrease voter confidence in the integrity of Utah's election system. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking once again about voting and election policy, something that really is at the core of what it means to be an American, to engage in self-government as part of the American experiment. And really we're going to be talking about some of the debates around potential reforms to voting and election policy here in Utah. And to have this conversation, I'm very excited to be joined in the studio today by Jonathan Madison. He's a resident fellow in governance for the R Street Institute. Jonathan, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Nick. I'm glad to be here.
And also joining us once again is Derek Monson, who is our Chief Growth Officer here at Sutherland and also our in-house election policy expert. Derek, welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Happy to join the show.
So let's dive right in, because this, of course, for our audience is familiar, has become a major point of debate in recent years, and especially in recent months. Every time there's a big election cycle, it seems like in recent years, there's debate and discussion around voting and election policy. And really, we've mentioned this a few times before on the show, but I really think it helps to sort of recenter to this very basic principle that it should be easy to vote and hard to cheat. And we didn't coin that. I don't remember where it came from. Initially, I think in years past in the state of Georgia, when there were some disputes about voting, it came up then. But just easy to vote and hard to cheat. So we want to protect the security and integrity of our election processes. We also want to protect the access to the ballot box for the voter. So what we're going to be talking about today is really different proposals or debates about one or both of those ideas, and hopefully kind of have a sense of the best way to balance all of that. So the first thing I want to ask you both is, here in Utah, we're in the middle of our state legislative session. There are some proposals to reform voting and election policy here in Utah, and you both have been tracking it closely and involved with this. And so maybe kind of start there. Let's get an overview for our listeners of what is being proposed here in Utah and kind of where is the debate about that. So maybe, Jonathan, if you want to go first, what have you been observing that is proposed at the legislature? Give us kind of the rundown of what's being considered.
So there's a lot going on in this legislative session. Most recently I testified on a bill that's looking to introduce voter ID, but in a way that basically would radically change the way mail-in voting works right now in Utah. And so it would require voters to vote in person, either on election day, as people do now, or you can still go to a drop box, but these drop boxes would be open only during a certain time and be manned, and you do that. Or you could still technically opt out and mail in your ballot, but you'd have to go every 2 years and show your identification that way. They're also considering some other reforms to the primary election system, in specific requiring a primary election that doesn't produce a majority winner in the first round to go to a runoff election that would be held later and then just between the top two candidates. And then just some other general election administration stuff, in specific removing the state from ERIC, which is monitors like voter rolls amongst several states and helps states clean up their voter rolls, and trying to find an alternative to that.
Let's stay on the vote by mail changes for a second. Derek, the House Bill 300 is kind of the main bill that is garnering a lot of discussion about, again, how we vote. Can you remind our listeners what is the status quo? What do we do in Utah currently, and how would this bill, as it's currently constituted, change, again, how you can vote here in Utah?
Well, right now, every active voter, meaning someone who's been voting in the system and not been kind of absent for years, I guess, out of the voting process, gets their ballot in the mail automatically. It's just sent to the kind of most recent address, that it's on file from the county clerk's office. And then you have a period of time where you can fill out that ballot There's an early voting period that starts several weeks before Election Day. You can mail it in, you can take it to a drop box, you can take it to a voting center early, or you can go on Election Day and drop it that way. So that's kind of how our process has been since 2020. It's ramped up to that between 2014 and 2020. And even before 2014, you could sign up on a list to vote that way, where you get it in the mail. And so the point is, mail-in voting in the current form has been around for decades, several decades now. It's something that's kind of long established in the state, whether it used to be voluntary or it's become default. And it would change that simply because these extra steps required to be on that list. Probably, given the fact that most laws and legal changes most people don't ever really hear about, right, until something hits them with it, it probably means a lot of people would just fall off the voting rolls because they, despite everything in the news, I mean, this is true of any law, right? No matter how much it gets in the news, a lot of people end up not knowing that a change has happened until, say, a tax increase comes out of their paycheck or something like that. And so in this case, what that means is they stop getting their ballot in the mail. And that would probably lead to a significant drop in the number of voters who participate. Now, maybe that rebounds over time because people go and sign up. Who knows? But it's a change that would have an impact. And the questions then become, well, is that change really needed? Because you are going to significantly impact this expression of self-government, and there probably ought to be compelling reasons for that.
Do you have a sense that, because again, kind of that theme we started with of easy to vote, hard to cheat, again, balancing security and integrity and voter access, it seems like whenever we end up in one of these debates, either here in Utah or anywhere in the nation about voting and election policy, that the contours of the debate tend to kind of pit those two things against each other, saying, well, we need to do something to increase the security and integrity of our elections, but it seems like that often or usually comes at the expense of voter access to the ballot box. And then on the other side, sometimes you have people talking about, let's just make it way, way easier to vote. Some people have even floated, automatic voter registration. But does that cause concerns on the security side? So can you talk through, does this debate in Utah, does it seem to be kind of pitting those two things against each other? And if so, is there a way to move forward as a state that would actually balance those principles? Yeah, well,
if it does get pitted against each other, I think it's because the people who are making the arguments think it should be pitted against each other. There are some people out there who really think voting should be completely easy, and that's the only thing that really matters. Security is something they care about, but they just don't really care about it that much because they think it's not a problem, so they just don't prioritize it or whatever. And then there are others who really think, well, no, voting maybe shouldn't be that easy, because we want educated and informed voters, and that means not giving everybody easy access to the ballot. The good policy approach on this, actually, I think, is a balance. You can accomplish both of these things, where it is easy to vote, and you still have secure measures on voting. I think Utah's vote by mail system actually accomplishes that when you really look at a lot of the evidence. There isn't any pattern of significant voter fraud that's been going on. They did an audit, for instance, on this. The legislature did, and the results of that came out at the end of last year. And they noted that there was some consistent problems that had happened between multiple audits in previous years and the one from last year. But when you examine the things that they found, the really problematic things went from 40 in a 2022 election all the way down to 2 in the most recent election they looked at last year. And that's big progress, right? That means our systems are working. And so, again, thinking do we have compelling reasons for the changes that they're proposing? I haven't quite seen them yet. There have been some arguments, that Utah is the only Republican vote-by-mail state. And politically, I can see why that would be a concern for people. But from a policy standpoint, from a voter standpoint, that doesn't quite pass the test, I think.
If I could add on to that, I think he's definitely right. And that, is it happening in Utah? Yes, it is, because I attended, like I said, on Tuesday, a hearing on House Bill 300. And So one, yes, there were a lot of people against the bill who said, like cheating doesn't really happen. So like who even cares about like election security? Like that's not a big priority to them, like you mentioned. And then one of the representatives, when he went to vote in favor of the bill, said that, you have to choose between convenience and integrity. And so today I'm going to choose integrity. But I actually think, as Derek was just mentioning, that like there are a lot of nuanced ways to do both. And in Utah, we can do that. And there are definitely ways to look at doing that. Because like what actually came up, especially among a lot of the Republicans in favor of the bill, was that they want results to be ready faster because it makes people uneasy when it takes a long time, and it did take a long time. And sometimes that is related to the mail, but there are ways to fix that. And that Utah voters, as Sutherland data has shown, want some form of voter ID. Both of those are worthy objectives that I think all of us can get behind, but there are better ways to do that without making voting far more inconvenient for Utahns than it is now. And I think, just like to go off of something else that Derek had mentioned, that, Utah is the only currently Republican vote-by-mail state. But something I actually noticed is that most vote-by-mail states are Western states, like Oregon, Washington, California. And so it's actually, if you look at a U.S. history perspective, it's not the first time, and it's actually much more common for like democratic innovation to happen in the Western United States before it happens in the East. And so there is like this tendency to frame it as like a Republican versus Democrat thing, but I think it's more of a West versus East thing, and I don't think Utahns should be ashamed of leading in this area, because Utah has led in democratic issues from women voting to citizen initiatives a lot in the past as well. And so I think that that's just an important context to keep in mind as well.
That's a really good point. I think it ties back to something that Derek has talked about and he's written about before, is this idea that we really should be driven by sound evidence, sound principles. That should be the thing that helps us arrive at good election policy, and maybe worry a little bit less about kind of how we compare to different states based on their political makeup, but really just if it's sound evidence, if it's administered well, as you said, Derek, if there's not really evidence of widespread fraud, then we should just kind of stick to those best practices. And Derek, I want to touch on, Jonathan mentioned some new Sutherland survey data. We recently put out this issue brief called Election Reform and Public Trust that we'll, of course, link to in the show notes. And I want to ask you to expand on this a little bit, because it really does kind of get at the heart of this question of these various potential reforms that are being discussed. Do they increase trust? Do they decrease trust? That hopefully can give a little bit of a roadmap for, again, how you balance those two principles. So one, Derek, I guess I want to ask you, was there anything in particular that stood out to you from this new issue brief that we think needs to be centered in the discussion we're having right now with policymakers?
Well, so we did this survey around Election Day, half before and half after Election Day, and we did that for a reason. But we asked people about the proposals that we had heard the legislature was considering, and basically, I think the headline is that the voters don't like what the legislature was considering at the time. So one of the lead issues was, who is the chief election officer? How is elections overseen by elected officials? And should that be someone who's elected or someone who's appointed, right? Folks in the legislature were concerned about the conflict of interest of an elected official overseeing their own election, in the case of the lieutenant governor, who is chosen by the governor, and they're both on the ballot. And 76% of voters, when asked, do they want that person to be appointed to address that conflict of interest or to be chosen by themselves as voters, said, we want to choose that person. We don't want them to be appointed by an elected official. So that was kind of, again, fairly straightforward. And the other thing was, there is seems to be no crisis of confidence in voting that would lead to be one possible justification that might be compelling for significant reforms of the system. When asked, are you confident, about your ballot being counted correctly, over 80% said, yes, we're confident that my ballot was counted fairly and accurately. When asked about ballots in Utah generally, it was even higher. It was like 87%. So Utahns, and this is something that's going to continue the theme of polls going back years, right? This isn't just a single poll finding this. Utahns are fairly confident in at least in how they report in polls. However, when you ask them about proposals and policy changes that might change that confidence, you get some interesting things that come out. Having voter ID is kind of by far the most confidence building thing out there by a net swing of 31 points in favor of more confidence. Things like eliminating early voting and requiring people to cast their vote on election day. That's the most negative. But then you ask about something that is involved in this bill, HB 300, the voter ID components there. But we asked people about eliminating vote by mail, or in this case, it'd be heavily restricting vote by mail, and requiring people to vote in person. And that was a negative 18 kind of movement. So I think what that says is, you could use voter ID as a way to eliminate vote by mail or restrict vote by mail, which is what HB 300 does, and take, one step forward or two steps forward, one step back kind of situation. Or you could take that as a signal that we need to do both these things, coming back to that kind of different approach where we can bulk up ID requirements around vote by mail without doing it in such a manner to make it so burdensome and heavily restrictive. And make it actually maybe more user-friendly for voters, and maybe even make administration better on the county clerk side. For instance, if we had forms of voter identification that don't require signatures, well, now you don't have to do signature verification, which is a time-consuming thing. Now, maybe we need signature verification, not saying that we ought to do away with that, but there are ways when you start to think about doing both of these things that you can actually start to make things better for everyone, or at least better for voters and for elected officials.
I want to remind folks that this new survey, it's Sutherland and Y2 Analytics, this issue brief, that it was a statewide survey of voters in Utah, and really, again, it's essentially, it proposed to the respondents, here are a list of potential reforms to a voting and election policy, and correct me if I'm wrong, Derek, but it wasn't really focused on, hey, do you like these or not? It was, would these reforms increase your trust in the integrity of elections or decrease your trust? So that's really focused on the core question, right?
Yeah, it's about voter confidence. It's not about public opinion, what do you like or don't like.
So Jonathan, how do you do that? When Derek's talking about, and that's what I read from the survey, is kind of those two principles of, yes, people say requiring photo ID is a big confidence booster. It's a pretty common thing that I think people have argued for a long time. But they still don't want to lose the ability to turn in a ballot with the way of the convenience they've had thus far. So how do you actually do both of those things?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think we keep coming back to this idea that, Utahns want both and you can do both. And so I think looking at other states, our streets, the institute I'm with operates nationally, and so I have a lot of experience in other states as well. And so like North Carolina, for example, you can mail in your ballot, but if you could do that, you have to add a copy of your ID, whether it's your driver's license, passport, whatever. In Arizona, they require you to submit your driver's license number, or they ask you to anyway. And in that case, Arizona uses it to check if you are a citizen or not against their databases. Utah wouldn't be doing that, although it might want to in the future. Either way, all of those add another level of identification to mail-in balloting. And something at this hearing, again, that a Republican legislator said that I thought was really interesting was he said, we do signature verification, but we need more than that. It's like when you get into your email, you need double factor authentication, right? All of this would provide a second factor of authentication on top of the fact that, you have your ballot and that's been securely mailed to you, and so you would know if that didn't show up and all of those different things. It adds just another layer and bring in this voter ID aspect to making sure that, yes, people can still mail in their ballot, they can still have that convenience, but it can bring in this extra amount of confidence that Utahns clearly support.
And Derek, this reminds me of something you've mentioned before, that I think it was you, someone on this podcast talking about election policy. If it wasn't you, just take the credit anyway. But kind of this idea that one of the elements of security in voting and election policy in Utah is the voter themselves. Because if I, as a voter, we were talking about this before we sat down to record, Jonathan, if I, as a voter, I submit my ballot, I get to choose how I turn it in. I can put it in the mail if I'm comfortable with that. I can take it to a drop box if I'd prefer. I can turn it into a polling location in person on election day. And then also I can sign up for the text notifications that will basically give me updates on the progress of my ballot throughout the process. It'll actually tell me beforehand, hey, your ballot's in the mail, so I know to look for it. And then it'll tell me afterwards, your ballot's been received, it's being processed, it's been counted. So Derek, I just want to emphasize that point, that I guess a worry I have is that is there a risk that our discussion around voting and election policy is ignoring that the voter themselves has a degree of responsibility and ownership over the security of their own ballot.
Yeah, I think this point is one I've used before. I don't know if it was on the show or not, but the strongest level of security you have in voting is yourself. It's when that ballot leaves your hand that the possibilities of fraud start to crop up. And that's true no matter how you're voting. You know what I mean? You can have people who try to, for instance, stuff ballot boxes at the election center. There are possibilities of fraud in any type of voting is my point. And so if you feel as a voter that the best way when you're balancing everything together to vote, including security, is to drop it in the mail, then I'm not sure that it's a government place to come in and tell you, no, you're wrong, and we're going to take that from you, that right from that ability from you. Same thing with drop boxes and voting in person at an election center. Now, of course, we need to establish security measures, right? That's not to say we shouldn't have security measures. But when we take that mindset so far as to tell the voter, again, who is the greatest level of security out there, that you're not enough. In fact, you're so far not enough, we're going to eliminate one capacity you have to protect your ballot by eliminating the choice to put it in the mailbox. That's where now it's kind of going against this idea of what voting is about, which is self-government, right? It's about you as a voter participating in that process and choosing your elected officials rather than your elected officials telling you what to do and governing your life, outside the kind of bounds of reason.
Yeah, if I could just comment, I think that is correct. And if you notice here in the data that we have, the second greatest confidence booster that Sutherland found was requiring that mail-in ballots be received by Election Day, which is another thing the legislature has. And something I noticed among legislators, one of their concerns was that they want election results to come out on or near Election Day because the gap gives people time to become worried about what's happening. And that, again, is a very worthy goal. And so, yes, moving up that deadline then will help you do that. We'll make sure that election results are available soon after Election Day. And then, yes, it becomes a voter responsibility. They have to get this before Election Day. So if Election Day is tomorrow, probably don't mail it, right? And so you send that. Because, yeah, it is something I think that does weigh on the minds of a lot of Utahns. A citizen comment at the committee said, I don't trust the post office with my ballot. Don't mail your ballot. Take that to a drop box or do any of the other options that are open to you. But for someone who does want to mail it, I think it should be an option as long as they're aware that, there's time constraints about getting this in to election officials by the right time.
I think ultimately it comes down to this principle of personal responsibility, right? Is for principled people, that is typically something that they care a lot about. And so do you really take that seriously, or do you only take that seriously until politically it becomes uncomfortable? If you take it seriously, then the voters can make their own decisions. And as long as we have security measures in place, which again, all the evidence points to the fact that we do, or the conclusion that we do, then trust people to be responsible.
I want to take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to get into some additional kind of broader voting and election policy issues. But before we do that, I kind of want to do my elevator question now. I usually do this at the end of an episode, but with these specific things we're talking about, the specific reforms being considered here in Utah, the survey data and the new issue brief from Sutherland Institute, if each of you, if the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, the Governor, the Legislature, if they all walked into the room and said, all right, tell us what should be the package of reforms if we're going to pass something this session that can strengthen election security, integrity, as well as voter confidence in the security of the system, but in a way that still protects voter convenience. What would that be? If you just rattle off, do these 3-5 things, and that's how you strike that balance, what should that look like?
Yeah, and so, I would go back to my idea that I talked about before, that I would add a driver's license number to give people, this added measure of security that I think will help increase voter confidence, which is a very important thing to do. I would make ballots only counted if they're received by Election Day and make sure that that's something that voters are aware of. And then I would make it so that voting clerks can count those ballots as they can come in and make sure that process is as easy as possible. Because, again, people really do like faster results. The United States and several states take a remarkably long time to count votes. And it doesn't need to be that way. The votes are sitting there, so you should let people count them. And so fast results with some form of voter ID, but with all of the convenience of the current system and without the added cost of all this extra election administration that they're proposing, I think that that's the right balance for voters, for the government, and for everybody involved.
Yeah, I think there's some value, particularly with the audit results that came out about there are people who are on the voter rolls that maybe shouldn't be because maybe they determined they were likely deceased, and that kind of situation can happen. So establishing, and shouldn't be just for, I think, vote by mail. It should be for everyone. An occasional refresh, like you renew your driver's license, right? So maybe we ought to renew our voter registration in a way that requires us to show ID. And this would do kind of bulk up that ID component in a way that isn't overly burdensome. You don't have to do it every year or every time you vote. I understand the reasoning for maybe doing it every year, but I think you could do it this way. Maybe once every presidential election cycle, for instance, where and there's some convenient way to do it. And then something I agree with what Jonathan was saying is, move up those dates of when you need to have your ballot if you're going to drop it in the mail, when it needs to be in the mail. Or just say, we're only going to count the ones we get by the end of election day, and then all voters know they need to get it in. And so if it's a day or two before, you might not want to drop it in that mailbox. I'm going to just go drop it off at a polling location or something. And then finding ways, I think the third thing is finding ways to help alleviate some of the burdens on election administrators. They are constantly being asked every year to do more and more and more and more in an environment when they're being attacked more and more and more and more. And at some level, it is just a human reality that if that keeps going, then you're either going to create human error because of all the pressure you're putting on people, or you're simply not going to be able to get the outcomes and results you want because people can only do so much. So things that would make it easier for them to process counting. So again, I look at signature verification as something that is a good thing, but if you could replace it with, say, like a driver's license, or even just the last four numbers of your driver's license, or there's even systems like in Louisiana where they have a separate number on their driver's license that's like a kind of like a PIN number, and they use that instead of the driver's license number because I think out of privacy concerns, if your driver's license number gets out there, is there concern about that? So some form of system like that maybe is more secure, and also maybe just replaces signature verification, or makes that option possible. Maybe signature verification is the backup, right? If there's confusion about a number, then you look at the signature. But something that just makes it simpler for our election officials to do the job that they want to do, and that they're there for, which is to make sure our elections go well.
Well, we'll package that up and send it and hope the legislature just adopts it. But the legislative process, of course, involves lots of discussion and debate, and rightfully so. So let's take a quick break. I think that was a great encapsulation of sort of a way to balance those principles of voter access and security for the ballot box. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, I want to get into some broader kind of questions and themes about voting and election policy, and maybe some commentary on democracy and ways we engage as citizens. We can talk about ballot initiatives. Derek, you've talked a lot before about this idea of what are the constitutional principles, how should that guide how we look at voting and election policy, and then maybe a couple kind of final things that are being discussed we can rattle through. But we'll be right back in just a minute. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn. Before we jump back into our conversation with Jonathan Madison from R Street and our own Derek Monson, I want to remind you, if you like this conversation, please subscribe to Defending Ideas wherever you like to get your shows, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. Just search for Defending Ideas on your favorite platform and click subscribe. And if you're watching on YouTube, click the little bell icon on the corner so you get notified each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. You can also access all of our previous episodes and clips at defendingideas.org. So, Jonathan and Derek, the thing I want to talk about now is kind of a little bit of a broader discussion about voting and election policy. When we were kind of prepping before we sat down to record, Jonathan, you made this really interesting point about how we view voting and election policy. I think most of us view it as through the lens of the voter, that, well, I want to make sure that I can vote in an easy and efficient way, and I want to make sure that I know that I can trust that everything's secure. But this idea you raised of, well, if you're an elected official, a candidate, if you're a politician, sure, yes, you care about that, but there's also this question of it, well, I have to get elected. So I wonder if you could expand on that idea a little bit about, when we talk about voting and election policy reforms, who should we be thinking about as far as, what's going to make things easier for, again, voters, elected officials? What should be the focus when we're talking about these kind of reforms?
Right, yeah. I was just mentioning that, I tend to put a lot of these reforms into two baskets. Does this make voting better for voters? And that can be, it's easier for voters, or it makes voting more secure for voters, either way. Or is this making voting and elections better for politicians? Meaning, does it make elections easier? Does it make it easier to contest them? Does it mean that they won't have as many seats or areas to try to contest? They won't have to spend as much money on campaigning, things like that. And so I think that it's really important when we look at these, and a lot of times something from both baskets will be packaged together to try to make it more palatable. And so I think it's really important that when we approach these reforms from a policy perspective, recalling that, elections are for the voters. It should be hard. It should be contested. It should be hard for a politician to get into office because they're earning something from you, the voter. And so we shouldn't be passing reforms just to make sure politicians don't have to try so hard next time.
Derek, you've done a lot of work looking at the Constitution. That's obviously a core pillar of what we do here at Sutherland, is looking at constitutional principles and applying them to the policy questions of the day. How do you do that in this case with what Jonathan's saying, that if we look to the text and the meaning of the Constitution, what does that tell us about how a candidate is supposed to earn something? I like the phrase you used, Jonathan, to earn something in an election from the voters. How would you view that?
Well, first of all, I think that's the right way to view it, what Jonathan is saying. You are earning kind of a sacred trust from a voter to wield power that is ultimately coming from the consent of the people, not from some, divine right that an elected official has or something like that. So that's positive. I think that's what our Constitution pushes towards. So, the Constitution, language of the Constitution itself is very procedural when it comes to elections. But there was a big argument about the Constitution that happened in the run-up to its ratification, as they were debating whether it should be adopted nationally. And we have a recording of that. Well, have it recorded in words in the Federalist Papers. And in Federalist number 10, I'll try not to get too in the weeds on this, but they one of the concerns they brought up was this issue of people governing for a certain group or a faction in society at the expense of everyone else, expense of the common good. And that's something that had really actually taken down republics to that time, anciently, and say like Rome and Greece and places like that. And so how do you address that issue? And elections became a key part of that. Specifically, having a broad base in an election, they talked about it geographically because at the time that was what the focus was, so that people who are in power have to come before a varied set of interests in society among voters, so that if they govern only for a small set of those or a faction of those, they're not going to be able to get reelected. And so in other words, the way we structure elections is a big key component of this issue, and it's our Constitution is written to encourage this broad set of interests being reflected. Now, geographically, right, it was different when you were in the colonies and you had all this land out west, right? This issue of geography is a big question. Nowadays, it's more about, well, what's the base of voters? Is it a broad base of voters or a narrow base of voters? So when we structure elections, it ought to be things that invite a broad base of voters that create a varied set of interests, so that we can't just govern by faction and hope to get reelected. And so when you're talking about things like vote by mail, it generally expands the set of interests that are going to be reflected in the people who actually go to vote. And so if you're going to restrict that, that might be something that could be good for certain politicians, right, who want to govern in a certain way that just reflects a certain set of factions or ideas that doesn't really reflect the common good. But that's not going to be good for the voters. And so as we look at these changes to vote by mail, if we're wanting to apply the spirit and principles of the Constitution, it ought to be with this idea in mind that we ought to create a broad base of voters, and vote by mail is one way to do that. And so if we're going to restrict it, we have really compelling reasons to do so, because we might be undermining the spirit of our Constitution.
Jonathan, I want to get the national perspective, because what Derek just described, it made me think of kind of this ongoing debate in the world of national electoral politics. It just over the years, and you will know much more about this than I will, but from what I recall, in years past, kind of the model of how you win a presidential election was, well, you've got your base, they're going to vote for you. If you're a Republican, the Republicans support you. Democrats support you. But the way you win is persuading enough of the moderate persuadables in the center, or the center right and the center left. And Derek, when you're talking about kind of this idea of broad interests, that's what I think about. That if I'm a candidate on either side, whatever side of the political aisle I'm on, if I can bring my base with me, but then it's incumbent upon me to persuade enough of, again, the moderate persuadables so that I have a pretty strong, obviously you need a majority, but a strong majority coalition that is sort of spanning different interests, that's how you win. And so, again, the status quo in the past was in primary elections, you're speaking a little bit more to your base, though still hopefully having some varied interests, as you're saying, Derek. But then in general elections, now you're speaking to all Americans. But it seems that in recent years and recent election cycles, the game has shifted to, now I just need to generate turnout. That it's almost like people as Americans, we're giving up on persuasion, and we're just focusing on, I just got to get my base fired up enough to turn out. And that's how I win. And it's all a turnout game. It's not a persuasion game. Is that right? Or am I wrong? And how does this tie into what Derek's saying about we should be centering on broad coalitions of somewhat similar, not similar, but like-minded enough to be part of a coalition, but still representing varied interests?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think you are definitely right. And I think that's been a part of like this really intense polarization we've seen in the country. And the result is, in the context of a presidential election, you were dealing with the Electoral College. And so we're dealing with what, people refer to as swing states, which if you look back on history, there used to be a lot more of that. There was a lot greater capacity to win this state or that state, and these different states moved around a lot. Even since 2000, like the number of states that have switched who they vote for president is quite high. But now it's, 5 or 6 states every election, and it's going to be a razor-thin margin. And so it isn't, to your point, that small margin means that persuasion matters less than just getting more of my people to show up. And so that has turned into almost like a perverse persuasion where I need to convince people that the other side is just completely unpalatable. And so that's the shift I see now kind of between primary and a general election is I'm appealing to my base, and now I'm going to demonize my opponent. And so that's not politically healthy, and it does go against this idea of trying to get candidates to appeal to a broader group and therefore be more palatable to the whole, and therefore be more representative of the whole, which is kind of the core tenet of Republican government that comes out of the Constitution. And so we've lost a lot of that in the polarization of recent years.
Well, ironically, we couldn't get back to vote by mail. In this new way of doing things, vote by mail makes it easier for you to get your base up because it's not more convenient for them to vote, right? So there's also an irony that you're pushing back on that in our current context as a matter of politics. Not that, we don't really make policy here at Sutherland based on electoral politics, but you are maybe kind of shooting yourself in the foot if you're going to make it restricted to vote by mail in terms of voter turnout of the people you want to vote.
Any idea on how to fix that? I mean, to bring elections back to, it's about persuasion. I love persuasion. I love debate. There's something about ideas competing against one another with the goal of persuading people that, to me, is a beautiful and important aspect of American self-government. But if it really seems like, because it feels like that in the way you're describing it, Jonathan, if that is sort of less important in our big political debates and discussions and electoral fights now, any ideas of how to bring that back?
Yeah, I mean, I can touch on that a little bit. And I think we can even go back to one of the Utah proposals that I mentioned. Utah is currently looking at something that a lot of states do, which is requiring primary candidates who don't get a majority to go to a runoff of the top 2 candidates and so forth until the winner has a majority. And so, I think there are varying ways you could do that. Some are better than others. But the idea of requiring, especially at the primary level where a lot of our elections are actually contested, requiring someone to get a majority first accomplishes what we just talked about. It requires them to appeal to a broad set of interests. But if you look at a lot of the research around that, it also produces stronger candidates. When the candidate can advance with just their base out of the primary, that's probably what they're going to try to do again in the general election. And so, look, trying to get these candidates, especially at the primary level, without changing anything about the way our elections work in terms of our general elections, making primary candidates already have to strive for a broader base to get past that primary stage, I think can not solve all problems magically, but go a long way to producing the type of candidates we want to see that are looking to maximize their appeal and in that way win power, not undermine their opponent.
There's another element of this, and one of the things on the list that I want to make sure we got to is ballot initiative, just because that's been a topic of a lot of debate here in Utah recently. But I think it ties into this principle of, how do you have election policy structured in such a way that if I want to get elected, I have to appeal to a broader set of interests. And with ballot initiatives, Derek, I'd love your take on this, is it seems like some of those that have passed recently in Utah, it was pretty thin margins, if I remember correctly. And I think one of the criticisms of ballot initiatives is that if it's really just a straight up or down vote for the public, whereas the legislative process is the way it's structured. It's intended to accommodate lots of varied interests, and because you have so many steps you have to go through just to get a bill passed in the legislature, it's a very intensely deliberative process. From when a bill starts to when it finishes, if it even makes it through, there are so many steps at which it can be amended and tweaked. And so help us think through that. How do we fit in kind of ballot initiatives, maybe some of the recent fights we've had here in Utah about it, with this idea of making sure that, again, when we're engaging in policy, it's able to represent broader interests. Do you draw a connection at all between those two?
I do, yeah. This is something that initially I've been thinking about and writing about for somewhat like a decade now, where, I think if there's ways to improve our ballot initiative process, it's around making it better informed and more deliberative, rather than just if you have the money to get the signatures and to produce the slickest campaign, you can get a law passed, right? That's I think the concern. When if lawmaking comes down to just those kinds of factors, and in Utah, increasingly that's been a possibility because of some things we don't need to get into here, but that's created an industry around signature gathering. So legislation that's being promoted in this current legislative session, which I think steps more towards this deliberative direction, is requiring those who draft potential laws through a ballot initiative to, if it creates costs, to have a clear structure of where the revenue is coming from, whether you're raising taxes, whether you're cutting a budgets elsewhere, to be able to have that information so that when voters are placed with something to vote on as a law, potential law, they understand the trade-off a little bit. Because right now you could just say, like, well, this kind of happened actually. We wanted to expand Medicaid, right? And that debate happened and the voters voted to expand Medicaid. And because it had a cost component in there, revenue component in there, but because it wasn't really structured well, it wasn't highlighted well, the legislature had to come in and actually change it to actually make sure the money would be there to pay for it. And that's not something that should happen after the fact, that, or at least that's something that voters should understand if they're voting on this, that they know that's what's going to be required. And so, again, doing something that requires voters requires people running ballot initiatives to produce for voters information that helps them make a better educated decision on that ballot initiative is a good thing.
Jonathan, your take on ballot initiatives, and even, again, some of the recent disputes we've had in Utah. Amendment D was, of course, a big controversy here, but how should we be looking at ballot initiatives in the context of what Derek's talking about? What's your take?
Yeah, I think that he is correct, and I think the more information you can have for a voter at the beginning, the better. But I do think that ballot initiatives still play a very important role, and I know at our street and the Sutherland Institute, one thing we definitely are overlap on a lot is the importance of the individual and self-government. And I think that, again, I'm a historian by trade, I go back to history a lot. Ballot initiatives are something that, again, are largely a Western innovation, and something that really allows a more independent-minded group of people, as have tended to be the case in the West, have an ability to play into the checks and balances system in our Constitution and overrule their legislature on certain occasions if necessary. And so, like, one of the things you talked about, how do we get better elections? Recently, a while ago, a few years ago, Utah passed, something to have an independent redistricting commission. Because that is something, gerrymandering that can create these uncompetitive elections where people don't have to appeal to these broad groups. And Utahns wanted that. And so, things like that I think are important. That, again, going back to this idea, does it help voters or politicians? Politicians aren't eager to create elections that are going to be competitive for themselves, even if the borders or whatever makes sense. And so it's the ability for citizens to weigh in, even though legislatures need to be able to deal with the finer details, I think is important. And it goes kind of back to the start of our podcast, striking a balance between allowing citizens to have a voice that can't just be overruled by the legislature, but allowing the legislature to do its job, which is to actually make the finer details of policy work.
How do you strike that balance? Because one of the big questions over the Amendment D fight was when can the legislature come in and as you're saying, Derek, on some of those other ones, amend a ballot initiative? Because before that whole fight went down, I always used to think of it in terms of when a ballot initiative is passed or when a law is passed for the legislature, they both become law, and that's it. They're both state code. They're both law. The legislature has the constitutionally vested authority to change law. So that seemed to be one of the rubs of that. Maybe it feels like we haven't quite gotten that balance right in Utah because of some of the recent developments as far as the legislature's ability to amend past law in the form of ballot initiatives or legislation. Any sense of what should that right balance be?
That is the $1 million question. Me personally, I fall more on the side of our legislative process. For some of these reasons we've talked about, being kind of making deliberative policy, but it's not to say I don't want ballot initiatives. Ballot initiatives have a role. It becomes very tricky when you try to figure out then, because when the Utah Supreme Court kind of started all this Amendment D stuff, they came out in the case of the independent redistricting law that was passed by ballot initiative and said you can't go in if your law is changing the structure of government and just annul it basically or change it in certain ways. And I understand the reasoning and the idea there, right? If you have a ballot initiative process in place that is meant to and structured to create a check on the legislative authority, then if the legislature just kind of overrides that authority, then it's not a check at all. On the other hand, so what does it mean to reform government, right? I mean, it's arguable that every policy reforms government in some way. And so is it meant to go wholly in the other way, that any ballot initiative effectively that reforms government, which again arguably maybe is a lot of ballot initiatives, maybe all ballot initiatives, does that mean they're completely free from amendment? And especially over time, every law gets amended over time because it gets outdated and it stops working in different contexts. And none of that was decided by the court. It was just saying, you can't do this. And so it's like, well, okay, for how long? Or is it indefinite? Or how do we decide whether something's reforming government or not that this ruling would apply? So they create lots of questions. We're having to answer now this question of what's that balance. I think maybe one last thing I'll say is that when you look at actually the history of the legislature coming in changing ballot initiatives, for the most part, they haven't dramatically changed many. I mean, we haven't had many ballot initiatives to begin with. Let's just be honest, right? We're talking about, a data set of like 5 or something like that. And they did significantly change one, which is the redistricting law. They made some changes to things like Medicaid and medical marijuana, but they didn't really change the guts of it. They changed some of these finer details. And so, again, when can they come in and change the finer details or come in and kind of change it completely? The court tried to weigh in on that. I think that the problems it created was we're going to have to now constantly go back to the courts to clarify what they meant because they didn't define it. And it might not really be definable. And that was kind of the problematic elements of that. And so when you have that kind of system where that's a possibility, I kind of fall back on, well, leave it amongst the elected officials and the voters to decide rather than the courts now becoming the main go-to. But I can understand there's disagreement on that.
Yeah, and I think it is an area where, like, Derek and I have some disagreement, but I think that that's good, and that's a good disagreement to bring forward,
That's
especially
right,
for the listeners of this podcast and for the people of Utah in general. And, like, yeah, so like he said, the legislature has rarely intervened to, like, fundamentally alter a ballot initiative. And I think a lot of where the problem for me comes is the time when they did intervene is when it affected their interests as politicians, not the implementation of a law that would radically affect Utahns, right? They didn't want to be told how to draw a district because that's really important to their future, their political futures. And that was the one time they intervened in a really significant way, at least in recent history. And so that's what I think was really concerning. And I think what's right about what Derek said is that what the situation that has been created now is going to revolve around a lot more litigation, and the court will have a lot larger role. And I can see why that is concerning to some people. And I guess my background, part of my educational background, took place in the United Kingdom. And in the United Kingdom, that's famously where we get our system of checks and balances from. But currently the system works with the idea that ultimately the House of Commons, the part of Parliament that is elected, should be able to overrule everyone else, whether it's the judiciary or the monarch or the House of Lords or whatever, because they're the ones actually elected. In the American system, though, where we have a much more balanced system and there's a lot more popular input, I like to see the system check and balance itself more. And so while the judiciary will be more involved, in my view, while that could add extra expenses and a lot of hassle and maybe even some unevenness in interpretation, I would rather that the legislature felt checked than be empowered as like the one branch that can overrule everybody else.
I can just have one more piece of context. This is more just, again, background to help understand. So in Utah's Constitution, the language is very, very clear that the legislature decides districts. Just basically just what it says, And so one of the things that the ballot initiative, the people behind the ballot initiative on the redistricting commission had to grapple with is they couldn't change that because you're not allowed by ballot initiative in the state of Utah to change the Constitution. You can only change state laws. So they couldn't just go in and say, the legislature can't draw the districts anymore, now a commission will. And so they tried to get to that end point without actually being able to get to that end point. So they came into this kind of complicated system of, well, we're going to have this commission that draws these things. The legislature can vote on them, but if people don't like it, they can sue. And so ultimately the legislature acting, well, I do agree, it was clearly, they had a self-interest in acting there. They also had a constitutional authority that they had in mind. It wasn't all one or the other. And in that case, it's like, at some level, now maybe this is going to come up in the current ongoing court litigation, but at some point the courts probably need to decide what the ballot initiative can and can't do. That hasn't been put forward to them, and maybe that should have been the first thing that happened. Right? Somebody should have just sued and said, "Do we even have authority to write this ballot initiative?" Because the Constitution says the legislature makes these decisions. And again, hopefully we'll get there because I think that ultimately is at the heart of all of this. That we're dancing around this question with other things, and that's really the thing that either decides whether and how this ballot initiative law is going to work.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I think it is important to say that the court case did not decide that issue, right? They didn't say, well, the ballot initiative is correct and in force, and they can't have them. The issue of how the maps are drawn and what the ballot initiative's authority is still in the courts. They were just ruling on a larger constitutional question. So it's two separate issues, and he's correct about how the Utah Constitution is framed. And so that brings us to a whole nother discussion about how you change that if we really want it changed.
Conversation for another episode, maybe.
Yeah. I just think, we've gone a little over just because this is important stuff, but the last thought, and then I'll kind of ask you for your 30-second just key highlights for our listeners on any of the things we've been talking about. But on this specific issue, to kind of bookend the discussion of that portion, it seems like the key question is not the substance of ballot initiative being good or bad, or not gerrymandering, whether it happens or not, or good or bad, but really who gets to decide what the law is. And you're saying, Derek, in the case of districts, it's pretty constitutionally clear. And I guess just kind of as a non-attorney, non-constitutional scholar, layman, it kind of seems to me that, well, if the legislature has the authority to go in and amend a past ballot initiative on medical marijuana or Medicaid expansion or any number of other things, then the court by itself shouldn't be able to say, well, you can amend these things, but you can't amend these things. That's what it seemed to be kind of a stretch of, there has to be something, in my understanding, in either in the Constitution or in state law existing that directs the legislature of where it can or can't amend ballot initiatives that pass. So that's the thing that seemed a little fuzzy to me, that maybe we're still deciding who gets to decide. And if the answer is, well, it depends on what the issue area is, that seems a little odd to me, that maybe it still needs to be sorted out in the courts and legislation. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think in the judicial decision, they highlighted that, one, the legislature does have the authority to amend or change any ballot initiative to make it function point blank. That was in the court decision. And it only comes when they're changing the actual substance or purpose of the initiative that they, again, do actually have that authority under the Constitution, but that they have to show a compelling government interest. And so that's where all of this confusion extends is what is a compelling government interest and who decides that. And so it is definitely a question that's up in the air that we have to figure out as a state moving forward.
Maybe the last thing I'll say is I was at an event talking about this shortly after the court ruling, and it was down at UVU, and a scholar who worked at Salt Lake Community College made this point on these kinds of issues that only attorneys are going to be asking these questions, right? This is clear to everyone else. Of course, the problem is everyone who's making the decision on these are all attorneys, right? It's all the Supreme Court justices and the attorneys coming before them. So it's true, these are all legal in the weeds questions. But the problem is those the people making the decisions fall into those categories, and so they matter. And it's a lot of vagueness right now that maybe will get fleshed out over time. My concern is that's not possible to flesh them out to the level of legal precision that you're just not going to have lawsuits. And so, but we'll see. Maybe that could be wrong. Maybe there is a settled kind of understanding that we come to in a number of years, and then everybody knows what the rules are and how we do it.
Well, in my mind, this is the beauty of public policy and having these kinds of discussions, because sometimes there's some really nuanced things we need to work through as a state. And I'm grateful we have a good system of checks and balances and structures in place to do that. So as this issue progresses, especially these questions about ballot initiatives, as things develop, Jonathan, will probably love to have you back on the show to talk about those further. Before we go, 30 seconds, what's the one big thing you think the audience needs to remember from this conversation, from anything we talked about today? As they're looking at what's being debated in the legislature, as they're thinking about voting and election policy, for the next election, for the next presidential election, what's the one big thing you want to make sure our audience walks away with?
Yeah, I want to reinforce our point from the beginning that, it's possible to have elections that are safe, secure, and accessible. And so it isn't something that you need to frame as a fight between convenience and reliability or convenience and integrity. It's okay to have both. It's possible to have both, and you should want both and expect that from your legislature.
Derek, final word.
Well, I think it's that if you want your ability to vote to be reflective of your views, now is the time to engage, right? This is not a call for grassroots kind of activism, but it is a call for the process of self-government to work, which means your lawmakers need to know what you, as a self, in our self-government system, think. And so if people reach out to their policymakers, they respond to that stuff. We've had some things that kind of criticize our elected officials, but I can tell you from a lot of experience in interacting with them that they care about what their voters think, what their constituents think. And so if you reach out, it will make a difference, I believe. And it's kind of, they're debating this right now, and so now's the time to make your voice heard.
Well, thank you both once again, Jonathan Madison with R Street Institute and Derek Monson with us here at Sutherland. Thanks so much for being on this episode of Defending Ideas.
Thank you for having me.
No, thanks.
We're going to take one final break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back, guys. I think the most important principle we can remember from this discussion today is that it is possible to value voter convenience and access to the ballot and security, the overall integrity of our election system. Not only is it possible, but I think it's necessary to do both at the same time. You might hear these two principles being pitted against one another, with the implication that we have to choose between voting conveniently or voting securely. But that's not really the case. Our guest today outlined several reforms that can both strengthen security while improving public trust and protect the convenience and efficiency with which Utahns have been voting for many years now in this state. Well, that'll do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed the discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. And don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode on your own social media profiles or with a friend, family member, or coworker who you think might find it interesting. And lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.